Well, cool. Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Spartan Theology. We're definitely going to pretend that I didn't already go live and redo it. But, yeah, so this is actually round two. But with that, we got a pretty exciting show lined up. I got Dr. Liz Jackson on, who's been on a number of other streams before. But this is kind of a topic that she hasn't really done an interview on, so we're pretty excited to share that. We're going to be talking about, like, epistemology and disagreements, kind of how to think about all these things. And she wrote a paper on the topic, which I linked in the description. You can check that out. But before we get started or anything, I'll just throw it over to her. She can kind of introduce herself and just tell people where they can find you, what you're working on, stuff along those lines.
Yeah, for sure. So first of all, thanks so much for having me on. I'm really pumped about this discussion, and I was telling Ethan before that I like how he tries to interview people on topics that they just haven't talked about as much. And I don't think I might have talked about disagreement in Q&As, but I don't think I've ever done an interview on this. So I'm excited to talk more about this. So I guess a little bit about me. I did my PhD in philosophy at the University of Notre Dame. And then I graduated in 2019 to 2020. I was a postdoc, so I basically got paid to do research. So that was fun. And then I actually did that in Australia. So it was double fun because Australia is super cool. We were just talking about how awesome Australian accents are, but it's just such a beautiful place. It was super great to live there. And now I'm an assistant professor of philosophy at Ryerson University, which is a actually pretty large university in Toronto. So it's really fun. I'm really enjoying the first year, although it's a lot too. You're, doing these new preps and lots of new students, and our class, I'm teaching critical thinking this semester, and it actually starts on Friday. So it's been a crazy week, but this is a nice break to kind of talk a little bit more about research rather than just doing all this teaching stuff, which I've mostly been preoccupied with. And I guess I'll add too, just really briefly, a little bit about kind of my research. So my main research is in epistemology and philosophy of religion. So I'm interested in, a lot of things in epistemology. My dissertation was actually very related to something we're going to talk about today. Not disagreement, but this other thing, belief and credence, these two attitudes that epistemologists concern themselves with. And we are going to explain what that means in a second here. So stay tuned for that. But I'm also interested in philosophy of religion. So a lot of my research is kind of on two main topics, the rationality of faith and Pascal's wager. And I've probably done the most interviews on Pascal's wager, so you might have seen me talk about that before. But today we're gonna talk more about epistemology stuff. I think some religious disagreement stuff could come up, so it might have some implications for philosophy of religion at least, but we're gonna talk about disagreement. So
Nice. Yeah. I've definitely enjoyed your work on Pascal's wager. And I did find I'm sure you would probably, well, I don't know if you agree, whatever. One of the more interesting ones was your interview with T-Jump, which was very out there a little bit, where I could definitely tell you, took you by surprise. He was basically, well, I might think that atheists are way more likely, are the only ones that even have any chance to go to heaven or something. I'm like, what is, yeah.
But, yeah, he was like, what's your argument that atheists don't go to heaven and theists don't go to hell? And I was like, I actually don't know if I could just give you one right now, but yeah. I think most people probably wouldn't think that. But
and he was just wouldn't concede. But it was pretty interesting, I thought. But then the better one was definitely your what we were talking about earlier, was with the Cosmic Skeptic, the debate or whatever. That was interesting, because that really got into the whole infinity thing and all that stuff.
Yeah, infinity gets tricky. And it's it involves so many disciplines too, from philosophy to math. So that was it's a very big topic, as some people like to joke. The SEP, Stanford Encyclopedia full of philosophy entry on infinity, that's the first sentence. Nice. Infinity is a very big topic, so anyway.
But with that, I guess we can get right into, like I said, we created a little presentation that I'll pull up, and I guess you can't necessarily see the presentation unless you're looking at the stream or whatever, but there's nothing really here. It's mainly just definitions and stuff, just kind of help people follow along, so I don't think it's gonna be a big deal. I know we laid out the Word document too, so
yeah,
it'll go along.
No, that sounds good.
Yeah, but so I guess just kind of get things started. What are we talking about here? Just kind of introduce the topic, And like, what do we mean? There's like the big definition that's definitely required here at the start is like, what is like a peer? What are we talking about with disagreement? Just like a kind of overview introduction to like what we're going to be talking about.
Yeah, definitely. So I guess one way to kind of think about our general topic today is this thing that's called the Epistemology of Disagreement. And this basically concerns, I guess, in the most general terms, the question of how we should change our attitudes, how we should, believe differently or have different opinions when we encounter someone that disagrees with us, that has a different opinion than us. And you can even think about it as kind of like a problem. Like, what do we say about all these controversial issues and about all these smart people that disagree on all these controversial issues? Like, do we need to like change our opinions? Can we not have beliefs about controversial things? And it's actually kind of a puzzle because on the one hand, it kind of seems like, well, we can have controversial beliefs, but on the other hand, it's like, but there's so much disagreement about it. Like, how do we reconcile that? So a lot of the epistemology of disagreement literature is about that. And I definitely think we should define this term called peer. Sometimes it's called a little more technically epistemic peer, but basically what it means to be an epistemic peer, and I think I put on the slide, it's basically someone who's epistemically on a par with you. And maybe I'll say a little bit more about that. So when you can think about it as like, how likely is this person to have gotten it right about the question that we're disagreeing about? And if they're roughly equally likely as you, they're probably epistemically on a par with you. And if they're an expert on the topic, then they're probably not your peer, they're probably your superior. And if they've never thought about the topic at all before, or like don't have very much evidence about it or something, then they're likely not a peer, they're probably an inferior. So epistemic peers normally have similar evidence about some topics. So if there's a bunch of arguments that you're aware of and I'm not aware of, we're probably not peers. And they're also roughly similarly reliable on that topic. And in the philosophy literature, there's actually a number of different ways people define epistemic peers. So I'm not giving a perfect definition, but leaving it a little bit vague. I don't think a perfect definition is kind of necessary for what we're talking about today.
Yeah, I would just say, like, just the big thing is, like, that they're on the same level in regards to, like, what we're disagreeing about is pretty much. And you don't necessarily, like, as I'm thinking about this, there's, like, it's pretty interesting because, like, especially on, like, religious topics, it's, like, I don't know, there's a lot of bias, obviously, that goes into this, too. So it's not necessarily just, like, how much they've studied or anything like that, but, like, I guess you can take into account, like, okay, if this person was, like, abused by someone in the church or whatever, like, that is reasonable to think maybe they're not, like, your peer because maybe they're like, if they're clearly, like, showing this too, you know what I mean? Like, I'm not saying everyone that had a bad experience, like, can't think about the arguments critically, but I think that's something to, like, take into account. They may not be necessarily your peer, but as far as, like, these things go, there definitely are people who are on the same level and think about these things about the same as you do, and you would consider them your peer. So yeah, with the next slide we have is, like, some of the typical approaches. So I laid out, like, the two you put in your paper as far as I don't know why I'm not even going to try and say I know it in my head, but now, first time I'm saying it out loud, it's like conciliationism is just like a weird word to say. That's it. Yeah.
It's very weird.
Steadfastness are the two that we laid out here as, like, the typical ways to approach this. So if you could just kind of, like, spell those out a little bit and just talk about that.
So just tying this into the epistemic peer thing. So the way, one way to think about, like, what the question is, what should we change our opinions when we encounter a disagreeing epistemic peer or not? That's kind of the question. And so these two views, which you pronounced exactly right, actually, steadfastness and conciliationism, they basically just take opposite positions on the question of whether we should change our opinions when we encounter a disagreeing epistemic peer. It kind of sounds like a lot, but hopefully that's clear. So conciliationists, they say when you encounter someone that's kind of your epistemic equal, similar evidence, similarly free from bias, similar reliability, you should change your opinions. And probably what you should do is change them in the direction of this other person. So if you're really confident and they're really not confident, you should move your confidence down, for example. And I guess I'll say a little bit about why they think that. So one case that's often given in the literature is this, they call it the restaurant case. And so it's basically this case where, let's say, Ethan, we went to dinner and we're trying to figure out, we're just going to split the bill and not really worry about who ordered what. And we both are good at math. We both, similar reliability, we're epistemic peers. And you're like, we owe 27 each. And I'm like, we owe 25 each. And then, and so I do the math, I think we owe 25 each, but then when you get 27, what should I do? And it seems a little bit weird to say, no, you can just keep believing 25 because that was the number you calculated. It's like, well, I don't know. I feel like that's a little bit closed-minded. That might be a little bit dismissive of you. And it's not like if you were like a 3-year-old or something, like that would be different, right? But you're good at math, you're competent. And so conciliationists will say, look, you should give the fact that a smart person who's your epistemic peer disagrees with you, you should give that some weight. And I think in general, they say, look, it's just closed-minded and dogmatic. That's if you combine closed-matic and dogmatic, you're closed-matic. That's a new made-up word I just made up. So it's closed-matic. I'm just kidding. To ignore the fact that there's this peer that disagrees with you. It seems like it's not the right response to disagreement. Shouldn't you give weight to the fact that there's this peer that doesn't agree with you? So that's conciliationism. The other kind of main view in the epistemology of disagreement is what's called steadfastness. And steadfasters say, you could think about the name even, you can remain steadfast when a peer disagrees with you. Your opinions don't have to change when you encounter disagreement. And one of the main ways that steadfasters will motivate this is it seems like we can have opinions on controversial matters. Like just because there's tons of disagreement about, say, abortion doesn't mean it's automatically irrational for me to, take a stand on that and say, I think abortion is wrong, or, I think abortion is permissible, whatever, just to take one example, but political views, moral views, views in philosophy, views on whether God exists. It seems like these are things that we can have opinions on, and just because you have an opinion doesn't mean you're irrational, right? But if conciliationism is true, it's hard to see why we could have at least strong opinions on those, because we should be deferring to these smart people that disagree with us. And I think a related worry too is it's called the spinelessness objection. And it's basically this idea, it's like, let's say I do a bunch of research, I think about it a lot, I read some books, and I come to have a strong conviction that eating meat is wrong because of factory farming and the way that animals are treated in these farms. So I think it's wrong to eat meat. And then I come along someone else, and let's say they've also done research and they're smart, so they're my epistemic peer, and they think it's fine to eat meat. And then as soon as I encounter them, despite all the research and kind of this conviction that I've come to, I just say, oh, I guess I'll give up my belief that eating meat is wrong. And it just seems like there's something like you should stand up for your belief and for your conviction and for the fact that you think you have really good evidence that factory farming harms animals in this morally problematic way. And so that's kind of another motivation for steadfastness. If you're just constantly deferring to the people around you, you can't really take a stand. You can't really have a view of things. You're just going to be kind of washed around by the people that you encounter that disagree. So that's called the spinelessness objection. I don't know, this might be going into too much. I guess I'll just mention the third thing briefly. Another thing that I think is kind of interesting is when a group has members that disagree with each other and aren't just deferring to each other's opinions, there's some really interesting evidence in like social sciences and philosophy of science that this actually helps the group be more likely to reach the truth in the long run. So if everyone in the group kind of has the same opinions, they're less likely to reach the truth. People are less likely to explore low probability hypotheses that might actually end up being the right ones because they're just deferring to other people. So that's kind of another reason that people like steadfastness. There's these epistemic benefits of disagreement.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense for sure. Like, it definitely seems, and that's what we'll get into in this next part, but it definitely it seems important to have disagreement. So therefore, some part of steadfastness definitely needs to be true. but like you definitely, it does seem pretty closematic to say that use your word or whatever. That
I love
like
it.
you
I love
can't
it.
ever change your mind. Like that seems weird too, to just think like, oh no, I'm right. But
Right.
yeah. So it's definitely like we'll get into it in this next part. So you kind of have a solution that kind of takes both these into account. So we can kind of talk about that, and yeah, we'll just I'll let you get into it, and then we'll kind of talk about your solution, or not necessarily just you, I guess, that didn't come up with this, but.
Yeah, no, there's a number of people that kind of defend this idea, just if people are curious. And it's kind of me and like another person that just published a paper is Laura Vushak, who's kind of one of my philosophical heroes, and I really like her work. So if you don't know about her, I would recommend her. She does also epistemology and philosophy of religion. But anyway, so we both kind of have a similar view on this, but I think we also sort of have different arguments for it. She focuses a lot on the epistemic benefits of disagreement part, and kind of benefits you can, anyway, I won't go into all the stuff about her paper, but yeah, so a big part of why I wanted to kind of go through conciliationism and steadfastness a little slowly is because one of the main moves that I want to make in this paper is saying there's actually something kind of very intuitive, it's basically what you just said, about both these views. Like it seems like they both get something right. And so that's, I want to kind of get the audience to see that and kind of say, yeah, like it does seem closed-minded to ignore smart people when they disagree with you, but it also seems bad to just change your opinion whenever someone disagrees with you and adopt theirs or move closer to theirs or whatever. Like it seems like there's something going for both steadfastness and conciliationism. So, and like, I can't see the slides, but I'm pretty sure what we had written on those.
I have it laid out, I could kind of describe it. I just have like opinion. So like, that's like a big part of this is like the way you define opinion, because as we saw in the previous one, it's like your opinion should change or your opinion should not change. And like, what are we actually talking about when it comes to opinion? And then the belief credence dualism. So like, what is belief? What is credence? How do we kind of like use both those things to take the best out of both worlds, essentially?
Perfect. I just wanted to make sure that opinion was on there. And sorry. So yes, exactly. So when we say change your opinion or not change your opinion, that's actually ambiguous. And it's ambiguous between two mental states, two kind of attitudes that we have that epistemologists talk about. And this is, like I mentioned at the beginning, one of my big areas of research is how these two attitudes relate to each other, why we would have both. So the first attitude is belief. Belief is familiar. It's something, we talk about all the time. I believe this, I don't believe that, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of times we'll say think, I think this. I think a lot of times when we use that term, we mean belief. So think, believe. And basically what a belief is it's taking something to be the case or regarding it as true. So, I believe 1 + 1 = 3. I might check the forecast. I believe it's going to be sunny tomorrow. But when we kind of think about, at least the way epistemologists think about belief, there's basically 3 main belief-like attitudes we can take towards a statement. So when it comes, and let's use God's existence here, because I think that question is often this 3-part belief model is often more familiar with the question of God's existence, but it actually applies to any statement at all. So let's say God exists. There's 3 belief attitudes you can take to that. You could believe it. So you say, I believe that God exists. You could withhold belief on that. So you could be agnostic about that. So when you're agnostic about something, you don't believe that it's true, but you also don't believe that it's false. You're withholding belief. And other things that you could be agnostic about, and something I'm agnostic about, is whether I have an even number of hairs in my head. I'm agnostic about that because I have not counted any time recently, and it's kind of a 50-50 shot. Or if I flip a coin and I haven't looked at it, I'm agnostic about whether it landed heads. So you're agnostic about something when you're kind of non-committal. And then there's disbelief. So if you're an atheist, at least the way that I could realize this is controversial on YouTube, which that's a whole nother issue.
I was trying to hold back from making a statement about that, but it shouldn't be.
Yeah, it's frustrating because, so I'm just going to kind of go by the way that philosophers talk about this, and we can debate about terminology later. But in most cases, when you're an atheist, you believe that God does not exist. if you don't like that example, you could say you disbelieve that 1 + 1 = 3, or you disbelieve that it's going to rain tomorrow if the forecast predicts sun or something. So we can talk about other examples if you don't like the atheism thing. But in most cases, I think it's useful to think like you could believe God exists, you could be non-committal on the question, or you could believe God doesn't exist. And that's kind of belief. So you have these 3 belief-like attitudes, and you can apply them to any statement about the world. Okay, so we have belief, withholding, disbelief, right? But one thing that I think is kind of interesting is it doesn't seem like that can be the full story about what's going on in our heads. And here's why. I said that I believe that 1 + 1 = 2, and I said I believe it's going to be sunny tomorrow. I think let's just say I believe that. I actually haven't checked the forecast, so I don't know. But let's just say I believe both those things, but I'm much more confident that 1 + 1 = 2 than that it's going to be sunny tomorrow. Because, like, we all know the weather app is like not that accurate, and like the forecast changes all the time. And, I think it's still reliable enough to form beliefs on, especially if it's like a 90% chance or something, but it's not infallible, of course, right? But 1 + 1 = 2, I mean, that's pretty dang certain. So epistemologists have noticed we're more confident in some of our beliefs than in others. We're more confident like that 1 + 1 = 2 than that it'll be sunny tomorrow. I'm more confident that 1 + 1 = 2 than that my car doesn't have a flat tire, even though I believe both those things. And so because of this, some epistemologists have said, look, it can't just be belief, withholding, disbelief. There's got to be more to that story. And what these epistemologists have done is they've actually come up with this system to kind of measure our confidence levels that goes from 0 to 1. And basically 0 represents I'm 100% sure that it's not true, and 1 represents I'm 100% sure that it is true. So I have, and they call this credence. So it's kind of like, you can think about it like confidence, and I'll probably use the word credence just because I'm used to that, but it's just, philosophers like to use big words, whatever. It's basically a confidence level. And you could, I have a credence very close to 1, if not 1, that 1 + 1 = 2. Whereas my credence that it's sunny tomorrow would be like 0.9 or something. So it would be high, but lower. And then, you can believe something, but your credence could be very high, or, maybe even get close to 0.5, and you can keep believing it, maybe even lower than that. I mean, possibilities are endless, right? But the point is that we have belief, withholding, disbelief, and then we have all these different levels of credence. You could have actually a potentially infinite number. I mean, we probably don't have like an infinite number of credences in our heads, but the possibilities for modeling it are infinite. So the position that I defend in my dissertation and in other places is what's called belief credence dualism. And basically the idea is we actually have beliefs and credences, and they both have some kind of role to play in our mental lives. So that's what dualism is. I know I'm throwing out a lot of big terms, so I'm sorry. And I don't actually think we need to talk about dualism itself as much here, but just more this idea of belief and credence.
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah.
So let's bring this back to disagreement. So what I want to propose about belief and credence is that if we have both of these attitudes, then maybe when we encounter disagreement, we should change one of them, but not the other. Again, we were saying, what's your opinion? But does that mean your belief, or how confident you are, your credence, or like both, or neither? Like, how does belief and credence fit onto this, I think, a little bit more vague opinion word, So yeah, I don't know. I guess I can say what my view is, and then I think we'll talk a little bit about why this is my view.
That's fine.
Yeah. So my view is that when you encounter someone that disagrees with you, you can continue to hold on to your initial belief. Let's say, you had this belief and then someone has a different belief. You can continue to hold on to your belief, but you should lower your credence, assuming they're like less confident than you. That's how they disagree. So I think I'm a steadfaster about belief. I think you can continue to believe even in the face of disagreement, but I'm a conciliationist about credence. I think you should move your credence down when you encounter someone who disagrees. So that's my view.
Yeah. Is there like and I'm sure you can like adopt this view with like a number of different ways, but like I didn't really think but the whole idea of like above point 0.5 or below point 0.5 like is where you kind of
Mhm.
like change your belief essentially. I think is kind of what you were getting at. But I guess people have different views on that. And I don't know if you necessarily said like you hold to that like under point 0.5 you should believe or it's like you do. I don't know. It's very interesting to think about this because yeah, I think like there's a lot of things. It's like interesting because it's like as far as the credences go, like I think this all makes sense. But as I'm thinking about it, like I think most people don't really like consider what their credence is until like they're faced with some reason. So like people probably believe a lot of things that they would have like under point 0.5, but maybe when they realize it, that's when they kind of change their mind. I don't know. It's like very interesting thinking about like how people's like this is like there's like philosophy to this, and then there's like it plays into psychology too a little bit, which is where it gets pretty weird. I guess it's kind of what's like going through my head.
Yeah, I totally. And it's also important too. Like, there's multiple different kinds of questions about how belief and credence would relate to each other. You kind of suggested this, but one is like whether belief just is credence or credence just is belief. So that's one debate, and that is like could like it would be more related to psychology. I think it's like what are these attitudes? Like, what is like the descriptive question? And then there's a whole other question, which is especially if we have both belief and credence, like how like when would it be irrational for me to give up a belief? Like, what if my credence is below 0.5? Is that belief automatically irrational? How do these relate to each other in the case of a rational agent? So that's actually like a whole nother debate. So there's almost these two realms, like the descriptive relationship and then the normative relationship. And I think in the epistemology literature, people actually they're not even clear about that really basic philosophy 101 distinction between belief and credence, and will often kind of conflate even those two. So I guess I'll just be a little clear here. What I'm interested in this paper is the normative one. So what should our beliefs and what should our credences be? I have a lot of opinions on the descriptive one too, and actually dualism is a descriptive view. It says they don't reduce to each other. Okay. But here we're focusing on this normative question: what should our beliefs be and what should our credences be? And then I actually think it's a really interesting question. Could you ever be rational to believe something and have a credence below 0.5? You know, I personally am not automatically going to say that that's irrational, but some people definitely would. So that's controversial.
I'm kind of thinking of like an example though. They'll be like, and especially like a less controversial topic or whatever, but like say, I don't know, I'm trying to think of like, but whatever, even just use like, does God exist or whatever. And like, I go through and read a whole book by like Graham Oppy or whatever, and like my confidence level goes down. But like I know like the next book in my stack is like a William Lane Craig book or whatever, and like before I like pick up that second book, but knowing that reading the second book, like my confidence has a good chance of going up because like just because of what I know about like people have read this and like it's raised their confidence, so I probably know or I believe that I don't even know, but like I would think that my confidence is gonna go up, but like in that meantime I don't think I'm like required to become an atheist even if my confidence went down like below 0.5 or whatever. I think that's like just like in that short term. And then it's like interesting because we know like our life doesn't just end, so like it's very interesting. I don't know, I'm about like going way down a rabbit hole that like I think that's like the point of this, and that's why it's interesting. But like I definitely don't have the solution to that, and
I like that case. I mean, I think another thing too that people will talk about is like the most likely live option. So there's this case that someone named John Hawthorne gives where you're at a horse race. There's 3 horses. The first horse is like 40% likely to win, and the next 2 are like 20 or like 20, and then the rest are like even less, you know? And so John Hawthorne is like, you could believe that the 40% likely horse would win. That's not irrational, even though your confidence, your credence in that is 0.4, you know? So that's another case. I actually have a paper where I outline a ton of cases of this that I think are kind of interesting. I like your case too, because I think that actually could be kind of demonstrating a certain kind of faith and how faith could be rational in the face of counter evidence where your credence is going down, but you can kind of continue in that belief, continue in that kind of, I see belief as like a sort of commitment in some way, like you can continue to believe God exists even if your credence is getting low. I think that could be in some interesting ways related to faith. So there's a bunch of different kind of interesting cases that we could think about here.
Yeah, for sure. And then the last slide we kind of have up here are just some objections to this view. So like I listed just a couple examples, and you already spoke about the restaurant case. So that's kind of a case where we should definitely hold to a conciliationist view. But kind of, I don't think that's necessarily like an objection, because I think you like take that into account with this. That's not so much. But like, how far do we take this, I think, is like kind of a thing to think about. So do we like change all our beliefs? Like, do we treat every belief we hold like this? And like, because there are people out there like that have some pretty wacky views when it comes to philosophy and stuff. Like people who hold to, I definitely don't know the word, but like that real contradictions exist or whatever. So like, should we think about like, just because there's someone smart that thinks about this, like should our confidence in something that seems like so like foundational and basic, should it really go down much? And yeah, and like kind of how I would think we could talk about too a little bit that we haven't necessarily touched on, but like how do we like adjust our credences like based on the like we talked about a peer or whatever. So like if they're inferior to you, then we aren't necessarily required to change our credences any. If we do, probably just very little. But like if someone's like a super expert in philosophy but holds to this like really different view, should we change? I don't know. Is it more about like the consensus, like how many people hold to these different views, or kind of like the level of the person you're reading it from? I don't know. Just kind of like how far do we take this is like a thing I think that we could definitely talk about here towards the end.
Yeah, there's so many interesting things to say there. So I'm like, I'm probably gonna not remember everything. So
yeah, I was trying to like end before I finished, but something else just kept coming to my mind. So I was like,
No, I love it. I love it. Okay, so there's a couple things I think are worth saying. So the first thing that I want to say is like, at least in this paper specifically, I don't necessarily commit to an exact rule of how you should change your credence when you encounter peer disagreement. And I think the rule is probably going to depend on a lot of stuff. There's a paper I can recommend on this that's kind of technical, but if you're interested, I could recommend that to people. But so I think a lot of it's going to just depend on the situation. It's going to depend on how many people disagree with you, and then it's going to depend on what status they have. So one thing I definitely want to say, we talked about epistemic peers, these people that are kind of epistemically equal or on a par with you. And a lot of epistemologists in the disagreement debate really focus on epistemic peers. But I actually don't think, maybe that's a helpful simplification, but I actually don't think that focus is totally necessary, because I think we should still change our opinion even if people aren't perfectly on our level. And in fact, if someone's like above us or like way above us, it seems like we should change our opinion even more, right? But then you could consider someone that's like pretty smart, but maybe they don't have quite as good of evidence as you, or they're smart, but they're not quite as good at math as you. And let's just to like say the restaurant case, like let's say you're a little bit better at math than me. When you find out I disagree, hopefully you would say, well, she's at least like a little bit smart. I'm better at math than her, but that still you should give that some weight, So I actually think this real big emphasis on epistemic peers isn't that important. But that's one reason I think credences are the right attitude to be changed rather than beliefs, because you have all these credences between 0 and 1. You have a 0.9, 0.8, 0.7, and then 0.95, 0.85, all these credences. And so if I say you're pretty smart, but not quite on my level, then I could move closer to you, but not as close. And then if I say you're an expert, you are super reliable, way more reliable than me on this topic, then I could move a lot closer to you, right? But with beliefs, remember, we just had belief, withholding, and disbelief. We just had 3 attitudes. So it's like, well, if I believe that God exists and you're an atheist, let's say we are supposed to conciliate, then we could both be agnostics. But like, what do we do beyond that? Like, if I'm a theist and you're an agnostic, like there's nothing in between there for us to move to. So beliefs are just really coarse grained is a way of putting it, but credences are really like fine grained and flexible. And so they let us move to different degrees depending on the situation. So depending on, again, is the person an expert? Is the person a peer? Is the person a novice but still sort of smart? Is the person just a total novice to the point where it's not even worth taking into their opinion at all? And so it gives us this flexibility with disagreement that lets us conciliate more, conciliate less, kind of depending on the situation and then how many people disagree with us. And then I think another thing that you brought up that is really interesting too is like you're sort of, I don't know how to say this in the less technical way. The word I was going to say is like the prior probability of the hypothesis, but that would be like how likely you think that thing is kind of given your current evidence. Because if someone smart says something, but it's just really unlikely given other things you know, then maybe you should conciliate less with them. So one example of that would be the smart philosopher who thinks there's true contradictions, you know, like they're really smart, they're an expert, and they've like maybe written a book defending this, but like true contradictions, like, are you kidding me? And so in that case, maybe you should move your credence down like that. Like, let's say you had a super high credence, there could not be true contradictions. Maybe you should be a little less confident in that, but I don't think you should treat it the same way that, you know, if an expert says something that wouldn't, you know, be at all surprising given other things you know or your evidence. So that's one thing to say. That's like addressing like one fourth of what you talked about.
Yeah, I can't hardly remember what I brought up, but yeah, that makes a lot of sense. The whole prior probability like is definitely key to this, I think, because like I think like another example would be like Jesus mythicism or like, I mean, like Richard Carrier probably has studied this much more than I have, but I just think the probability of that being true, prior probability is so low that like, yeah, maybe my credence has changed a little bit, but it's very significantly less than if maybe he told me like whatever, something else he had studied, but the prior probability for that was much higher or whatever. Then yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense to take that into account.
Yeah. And what's cool about credences is that they let you take that into account, but just a little bit. And if all we were thinking about was beliefs, then I guess you could withhold belief, but like that seems too extreme, you know? So credences are nice because they let you make big changes. They let you make small changes. They give us this flexibility. And I guess the other thing, maybe I'll just add to, at least you had a question about this, is like, I do think there could be a point at which we should give up our beliefs when it comes to disagreement. And I think, again, that's kind of just going to depend on specific things that I don't necessarily commit to in the paper. But on some people's views, like let's take the 0.5 thing, for example. So on one view, once your credence goes below 0.5, then it's not rational for you to believe anymore. So that's kind of a simplistic view, but you could have that view where, you know, I believe, let's say I believe like the tip is 25, I hear you disagree with me, and then my credence might actually drop quite a bit. And then especially if two people disagree with me, I think my credence will definitely be below 0.5, and then I should give up that belief. But I think when it comes to controversial issues and these issues that have been debated by people for centuries, I mean, like God's existence or whether we have free will, or, you know, especially these philosophical things, it's like your credence might go down a little bit, but it's going to take a lot of evidence to really get it below 0.5 if you have this view. I'm actually sympathetic to the idea that in some cases it's possible that you could actually continue, like we were talking about, continue to have the belief even if your credence is below 0.5. And it might depend on too what the belief is. And it might be that beliefs like the tip is $25, like that's not a really important belief. You probably aren't going to have a super high credence in that initially. It's not something that's kind of central to like your life projects. I think you could give up that belief pretty quickly, but maybe we have a different rule for when we should give up our belief when it comes to these things, like these really important moral commitments. Like, you know, I talked about that case where I'm really, really convicted about eating meat and I feel like I shouldn't eat factory farmed meat, or like someone's commitment to God, like I'm committed to, you know, God, that God exists. Like, I think those things maybe could survive, those beliefs could survive even if the credences got low, like much lower, more than just this basic belief about like how much dinner costs or something. So another thing you could do with my view is apply it to these really important beliefs, but then say you should give up the belief sooner if it's a less important matter, a belief that's less central to kind of your life projects or goals.
Yeah, so and we got a few questions in the chat that I'll get to, but one last thing I want to say is, like, I'm thinking about this restaurant example, and I feel like when, like, you encounter disagreement, my first thought is to, like, go back and look at my evidence or whatever. So I'm like, why are we disagreeing? So less like my credence lowers and more like I get a new, I don't know if like it's necessarily the same thing to say, okay, I go back and look at my evidence and say and like the reason I'm bringing this up, because I'm thinking, like, say you're at a table with 100 people or whatever and 99 of them disagree with you, and so you just take their word, like, because kind of under this view where your credence should lower, like if you were at a table and everybody, like, you came to 25 and everybody else came to 27, like 99 other people, I would think you should like lower your credence so much that your belief should definitely change. But I'm like, in my head I'm thinking of the example, like, say I would still think you should look at your evidence, because what if like they handed the wrong bill to all the other people or whatever, so actually it's like your evidence that's actually different. I don't know if that really like is the exact same thing, or that's kind of like such an outlier that it's like kind of talking about something different. Because I guess you're right. Like, this is more talking about your epistemic peer. So, like, I don't know. Real world examples are definitely like can get messy, because you could kind of just keep adding in variables or whatever. It's kind of like doing a math problem or whatever. Like, it's never gonna actually work out in real life exactly the way you do it on paper, because there's more variables than you're accounting for, and you can't really account for everything. But this is more like in a perfect world where your evidence is correct. Yeah, I don't think that like my example or everyone else having a different bill is actually relevant, because that's, as I'm thinking it through, that's kind of a different question. If that,
I think it's still good to think about, though, and I think I would agree with you. Like, your credence should go so low that would be a case where you definitely should give up the belief if you were actually in that case. But I think you're right to point out too, like, there's almost two different things we could think about when it comes to disagreement. The first is, how should that change my opinions? How should that change my beliefs? How should that change my credences? And that's kind of the main question that this paper is about. But there's actually another really interesting question that's related to epistemology and disagreement too, which is, when I encounter a disagreement, how should that change how I gather evidence? Like, what should that do to how I look for evidence, and the ways I look for evidence, and what kind of evidence I look for? And that's separate from like what beliefs or credences I should have in the meantime, you know? And so I think what you're pointing out, which is really good, like, one thing even a steadfaster could say is, well, maybe you could, at least in the one person disagreeing with you restaurant case, keep your belief in the meantime, just temporarily, but then go back and look at your evidence, you know, and see, like, did I forget to carry the one, or, you know, how good is my evidence really for this? And that's another response someone could give to that case. But I do think there's a ton of interesting questions there of how disagreement should affect the ways we gather evidence. And I do think in general, it seems like it should make us, when we encounter disagreement, it should make us want to gather more evidence, especially if we're going to kind of keep having the same opinions we had before. I think a lot of people this will happen to with God's existence too. Like, you'll grow up in a Christian home, you won't even know anyone that's not a Christian, and then suddenly you'll have a friend who's like an atheist or agnostic, and then you start really getting interested in like the evidence, you know? So, and I think that's probably a pretty rational response. But yeah, I think disagreement has interesting implications for the way we gather evidence as well.
For sure. So we can kind of get to a few questions from the chat. So first one I see here is from Tacit and whatever, can't read the word. Shouldn't we distinguish between a priori and posteriori statements here? 1 + 1 = 2 is certain. It's an a priori analytic statement. Yeah, so how do we kind of distinguish between these two things?
Yeah, for sure. So so a priori and a posteriori. A priori means it can be known before experience. So a lot of people think, at least a good amount of philosophy, if you say all philosophy, that's very controversial, but a good amount of philosophy, also math, is a priori, which means, you know, you could think about, they call it like the armchair discipline, where you can just sit back in your chair and do philosophy research. And people will like mock that sometimes too. But the point is, when you're doing philosophy research, you're not going out you don't have a lab where you're doing experiments and getting results. You're really, a lot of it is done by thinking, and in practice it's done by reading and writing and presenting at conferences and all of this stuff. But the main thing is it's not done in a lab, you know? So a priori and then a posteriori would be things that are known through experience. And that would be obviously things done in labs, but also like, you know, I know a posteriori that there's like a brown table in front of me or whatever. So it could just be basic things that you perceive as well. So I think it's really interesting to think about how this would, interact with both beliefs and credences. But one thing that's tricky is just because something's a priori doesn't mean we have perfect access to it. So think about like an unproven mathematical theorem. I think Goldbach's conjecture is one example. It seems like that's a case where, it's unproven. We don't know if it's true or false. Your credence in it should probably be around 0.5, even though if it were known, it would be known a priori. So I don't know that the a priori, a posteriori distinction would map perfectly onto like whether we should have a credence of one in something or not. But that is controversial. Some people think at least all like necessary a priori truths you should have a credence of one in. And then the question is, there's a huge challenge for them. It's called the problem of logical omniscience, which is we're not omniscient about logic and math. There's a lot of unproven theorems out there we don't know about. But it's a really interesting question and kind of gets into the epistemology of credence formation. So
for sure. For sure. The next one we have is from True Counterphobia. What is the difference between faith and belief? And this is kind of like, I think we touched on this a little bit, and you kind of did mention this with the whole, like, I think that's where, like, that intermediate state can come in, is, like, how it's related to this topic, at least. I mean, as far as faith and belief are definitely two different things where it could be used. But as far as, like, this conversation, I think you can, I tend to, as I'm thinking about this more and more, I tend to think, like, I could have faith in something and, like, have it boost my credence, I guess, if you hold to that view that it has to be. I don't know exactly how you went. I think we kind of touched on this. If you have anything else you want to say before I keep like rambling about faith and belief.
No, you're good. So I think there's actually some really relevant stuff here. I guess the first thing that's a little bit less relevant but I think worth mentioning is that belief there's lots of things we believe that we have no desire at all to be true, right? So I believe there's a pandemic right now. I believe that my classes start on Friday. Not that I don't want them to start. I just have so much to do before they start, so I wish they started later. I believe like I really need to clean my house. Like, these are all things that I believe that I have no desire to be true. But faith, I think a lot of philosophers think when you have faith that something's true, that requires some kind of desire for the thing in question. So if I say, if Ethan, you're like running a marathon and I say, I have faith you're going to win, but I really desire that you lose. Like that just doesn't even make sense. It's like, then you don't have faith if you want me to lose, So one difference between faith and belief is that I can believe lots of things that I have no desire to be true, but with faith, faith requires that desire component. So I think that has a ton of interesting implications, but that's not really relevant to belief and credence, but I have other interviews about that. So you should, check those out.
Yeah.
The thing that I think is more relevant to belief and credence is that I do think, so when it comes to, if I believe God exists, I'm saying it's the case that God exists. The world is such that God exists. If I have faith that God exists, again, I think part of it's going to be I'm going to have that desire for God to exist. And I'm also going to have some kind of commitment to God's existing. And some people think, this is controversial, but I think it's worth at least mentioning that because that belief is like this kind of epistemic commitment, once your credence gets way too low, it's going to be irrational for you to keep having that belief. But faith is more of this, it's like it has this desire basis, I guess. And it's this other kind of commitment, potentially. And so the thought is that you could actually rationally have faith in something, even if your credence gets so low that you have to give up the belief. So it's almost like faith can give you this steadfastness in light of counter evidence that just belief can't. This is controversial and not everyone agrees with this. And this will actually have the implication that you could have faith that God exists even if you didn't believe that God existed, which philosophers argue about a lot. But I think it's kind of an interesting suggestion that rational faith could be consistent with pretty low credences. So those are two potential differences between faith and belief.
For sure. And then our next one is from Pine Creek. Should one be less confident if a book says a man rose from the dead because of a very low probability? Never mind. I thought this question had a little more to it, Pine Creek. I mean, what do you mean someone should be less confident? Like, yeah, you should be. Like, you shouldn't just believe that for no reason at all. So, I don't think that's what we were saying at all. Like,
I would say, like, if something has a low prior probability for you, that's part of what determines how confident you should be in it. So yeah. And then I think there's a whole debate about whether someone rising from the dead would have a low prior probability and like the reliability of like scripture. And I mean, there's a bunch of like historical stuff that has to go into that too. So I mean, it's a very complex situation, but yes, your priors affect what credences you should have. Like, that's a very standard thing that epistemologists say. And one thing that I think is kind of cool about my model is that I actually think I give a good reason to think even if your credence isn't super high, you could still rationally believe that Jesus rose from the dead or rationally have faith that Jesus rose from the dead. So one thing that I think is really cool about distinguishing belief and credence is that it opens up these possibilities. Like, it's not just all what your credence is, it's also, well, what do you believe or do you have faith? And so I think that's kind of a cool possibility. Like, you might think like miracle claims, so unlikely, but my model actually would give us a reason to think you could rationally believe them even if they're unlikely. So there's that.
For sure. I definitely don't think under your view, like, if you found a random sticky note on the ground that said like some guy rose from the dead, you would believe it or whatever. There's much more that goes into this. So like, to put it that way. And
absolutely. Yeah. So it can't be just random and rational belief. I mean, it's not just things you just believe because you want them to be true or you believe them for fun. The point is just that sometimes evidence moves our credences around, but doesn't change our beliefs. And like this, everyone thinks this happens at least to an extent. If the forecast predicts a 90% chance of rain tomorrow, I believe and have a 0.9 credence that it will rain tomorrow. And then let's say it goes down to 80% chance. I'm still going to believe it's going to rain tomorrow. My credence is just going to lower a little bit. So it's just a question of how much can it lower. It's not a question of whether your evidence can change your credences without changing your beliefs, because it definitely can. So
yeah. So then next one here, he said, are there any instances in which you should raise your credences in your belief despite someone else being your epistemic superior? And I kind of asked him to spell that out a little better. So if you have someone who's an expert in the field, but they believe something conspiratorial, would your credence go up in that scenario? Are there other situations like that? And I think the best way, and we kind of touched on this already, is the whole like prior probability. So your probably credences should change, but the amount that they should change could be have a lot to do with like the prior probability. And I think like the Jesus mythicism example was like a pretty good example. So I think we kind of touched on this.
Yep. I totally agree. And I think too, another thing just to think about with experts is like, someone could be an expert on something but still be very biased on it, or like still be very disposed to believe like a certain conspiracy theory about it. And so expertise is actually going to be very relative to kind of whatever the disagreement is about. And I could be like an expert on one thing but not an expert on or at least not as much of an expert on a closely related thing if you had a good reason to think I was like very biased or something. So that's one thing to think about is just because you're an expert on one thing doesn't mean you're an expert on everything, and it could even be within a very similar domain. So I think you mentioned this at the beginning of the interview. We really have to think about like people's biases and the ways that people are maybe influenced irrationally by evidence, or by lack thereof, I guess would be more like it. People that are influenced irrationally, and consider that when we are thinking about how we should change our opinions in response to disagreement. But the other thing is I totally just agree with you. We also should think about the prior probability of the thing that they're saying, and that will also affect the extent to which you should move your credences. And I like the true contradictions case. I think that's a good one to think about, where maybe you lower it a little bit because this expert is claiming it, but you wouldn't lower it as much compared to something that didn't have as low of a prior probability. So
and then I think this is next one's going to be the last one from what I see. And this one said, is peer pressure sort of at play here for any of these situations where people concede, even on things that don't have a truth value, such as others believing a food is more delicious than you do? Yeah, I guess that is kind of interesting because, like, yeah, if someone's like an expert on I think an interesting case, like something kind of what they're bringing up, like a wine tasting expert or whatever, and they're like, oh, this wine is the best, and like, this person because they actually have like there is like actually like they can prove that they're an expert in this, but it's like a weird one because you're right, it doesn't necessarily have a truth value, but like I would tend to be like, I guess I don't know what I'm talking about, and this wine is great or whatever, even though like I have no idea. Yeah, that's just interesting, like how this plays into things that don't necessarily have a truth value.
Yeah, and I think too with the wine thing, there's probably some placebo effect going on too, where if some expert tells you this is super good wine, you'll probably think like it might actually even taste better to you because you have that belief. But yeah, I do think it's one thing we just didn't have as much time to go into, but defining like when a disagreement is even occurring is a huge issue. And I think one thing to think about is just because we think we disagree or it seems like we disagree doesn't mean we disagree. There's a couple cases, but one is what we were just talking about, like when it's a matter of taste. So I say vanilla's the best, you say chocolate's the best. Well, there's something kind of subjective about that question, so that what's the best is almost, I'm just saying like, this is what I prefer, and you're saying this is what I prefer. And those can both be true at the same time. So we're not actually, I mean, you could spell the case in a way where maybe we are disagreeing, but I think in a lot of cases like that, we're not actually really disagreeing. We're both kind of just expressing a preference for a certain thing. Another thing too that I think can happen, and people who debate a lot have probably experienced this, there's cases, it's not a matter of taste, but we're just using words in a different way. So you're saying X and I'm saying not X, but really we mean different things by X, and we don't actually disagree either. So another thing that what we were kind of doing in I think this whole discussion is presupposing that there's actual disagreement, but maybe step 0 is like determining whether there's even a disagreement or not, like even think about the tip case. We might say, how much do we each owe? Or, the restaurant case. And then I was calculating before tip and you're calculating after tip or something. And so then it's like, we don't actually disagree, even if we might have thought we did at first blush. So it's really important to figure out, is there an actual disagreement here? And maybe if there's a question about that, wait to conciliate before you figure that out. So
yeah, and that kind of what you said there about like the whole like before or after tax or whatever, like that kind of plays into what I brought up with like the 99 people or whatever. Like that's we kind of weren't disagreeing, we just had different evidence, and I think that's like something to think about. But that's like, I think that spells out why that's like a separate question from this, like for sure. And I actually skipped over Travis's question, but it should be a fairly short one. And he says, would you agree with William Lane Craig that one is rational in believing God exists based on the inner witness of the Holy Spirit, even with arguments to the contrary? And actually, I meant in absence of arguments to the contrary. Yeah. So you hold to like a reformed epistemology, which I actually have like seen some of your other videos where you talk about this. So I would say you would agree with that. But yeah, if you want to say anything else, like a short little thing about that, you can.
Yeah, for sure. So, and I guess this is actually pretty related to our topic too, because when it comes to disagreement, another thing that I think is often presupposed, and we were kind of just talking about this, is that you share similar evidence or even the same evidence about the matter in question. And then I think there's a really interesting question about religious disagreement, if that condition is actually met or not. And so we have to, have a debate about, to the extent that religious experiences and the witness of the Holy Spirit count as evidence. I think that they do. And so given that, if you have those things, you would actually not share evidence with a lot of people that disagree with you. And so that actually puts this whole conversation in a different category. One thing that I think is kind of interesting about my view is it doesn't depend on the existence of these perfect epistemic peers. So it could actually be that even if you don't share evidence, you should still lower your credence a little bit. And I actually think that's kind of the right view. If you come across really smart people that disagree with you about God's existence, it seems a little bit closed-minded to just totally ignore that and not take that into consideration at all. But my view says you can continue to believe that God exists. You should just be a little less confident. And then, like we were talking about before, maybe go gather some evidence. Maybe look at some of the evidence for and against, and kind of evaluate that and see where that leaves you. So my view would say that if you don't share evidence, there should be maybe some level of conciliation, but not as much as if you shared perfect evidence or something like that. So that was one thing, I guess. That didn't fully answer the question though. But yeah, I guess maybe the answer to the question is kind of what you said is, yeah, I do think people can be rational to believe in God based on the witness of the Holy Spirit or an experience of God. And in that sense, I'm a Reformed epistemologist. And I think the biggest reason or motivator for me because of that is I don't like go to a church and look at the people in the pew. And I mean, maybe I'm just pessimistic. I don't think most of them are aware of the arguments for God's existence. Maybe some are, but a lot aren't. So I personally am not going to go in there and say all these people are irrational. I just don't think they are. And I think for me, that's a big reason why I subscribe to Reformed epistemology, is because I do think we can give a story about why they're rational, and they don't have to know about all these arguments for or against God's existence. So
yeah,
so that's kind of yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. We were kind of talking about this a little beforehand, and I mean, in my opinion, I don't necessarily think any of the arguments even work. So if that's the case, I don't, and I'm still a Christian, so hopefully I'm not irrational, basically, and I don't think I am.
What about Pascal's wager?
Yeah, I actually do think Pascal wager is pretty powerful because, like, I do think, like, I think, like, we can do a lot. I don't think we can, like, choose what to believe, but I definitely think, like, what we choose to do has a big impact on what we believe. So, like, taking that wager and just saying, I'm going to go to church and, like, do these things. Like, I've heard you talk about, like, it's less about choosing what to believe and more about, like, how to act or whatever. Like, so I'm going to act in a way that would cultivate belief. That's what I think I've heard you say. And I think that makes a lot of sense to just, like, make that choice because something in me tells me that, like, this is true, or that I have some reason to think it would be true. And I think it's reasonable to go through with the actions that I want to do that would cultivate belief. I think it would be, I don't know if it's necessarily, like, because of the Pascal wager thing, but I don't think that really has to do with it necessarily, because, like, I don't think you have to believe in hell and heaven or, like, and afterlife stuff. Like, I don't think that necessarily has to come into play, which it normally does with Pascal's wager, you know, but like that. But I think there has to be some sort of, like, benefit or goal you're, like, seeking after, or whatever that may be. If that makes sense.
Cool. I'm glad you like Pascal's wager. Can I ask you another unrelated question before we close? Okay, so your name is Spartan Theology, and I think my husband would kill me if I didn't ask you. Is that it at all related to Michigan State Spartans or no?
No. Okay. No. Like, everyone asks me about the name, and it really doesn't, like, have too much to do with it. I grew up in a town called Spartanburg, and I thought Spartan Theology sounded cool. And
it does. It sounds very cool. But also it's the Michigan State. Michigan State.
You can see my Clemson thing behind me.
Are you Clemson?
I went to Clemson, yeah. So I'm a pretty big Clemson.
Did you follow the football team this year?
Yeah. I mean, we did pretty well, but then had a pretty disappointing end where we lost to Ohio State.
I'm very sorry. I'm maybe goes without saying I'm a big Notre Dame fan. So I feel your pain. Your pain. I mean, I think I probably would have bet that Clemson would go further than Notre Dame would, even despite, like, all the wishful thinking I was doing during the whole season. But yeah, it was very disappointing for both. And then I was just we were watching the national championship game actually on Monday, and I was just like, I just want everyone to lose.
Yeah, I didn't even watch it. I was just, like, just disappointed. But yeah, I don't know how I'm saying that when we've been in, like, every single playoff game that's been played essentially, but I still was disappointed this year. But yes, so that was a good way to end it, talking about some Clemson football. But Yeah, I hope everybody enjoyed this. We had a good many people in the chat, which was really cool, so I appreciate that. If you haven't subscribed, please do. It definitely helps me grow. And yeah, so with that, we'll head out of here. And yeah, just thank you guys for watching. Thank you, Liz, for being on with me. This was super fun, for sure.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I had a really good time. Thanks, everyone, for your questions. It's funding.